Hello everyone and welcome back to another video. Today I'm going to be continuing with the Lionel Johnson project, this time tackling his non-metallic shield. I would consider this along with the previous line videos to be pretty advanced level tutorials, and this one, just like the previous ones, will incorporate lots of glazing, so consider checking out the previous fundamentals video if you need help with this. Getting started here, and I'm going to be airbrushing the shield with Vallejo Black Primer. You can use any primer for this, but I find this to be very smooth, and that's going to help with getting a nice smooth finish on the non-metallics. Now I'm going to be starting with the red here, with a base coat of corn red, and this is applied also via the airbrush. I'm using the box art as some inspiration here, but it's not going to be an exact match, as I want this red to be slightly cooler than the gems and the other saturated brighter areas of red on the miniature. I then airbrush some Wazdaka red onto the areas of the shield that are going to be catching the light. This light placement will be continued later on with the non-metallic gold itself, remembering here the orientation of the parts once they're assembled on the miniature itself. I started to base coat the non-metallic gold areas using XV88. With projects like this where I'm going to be tackling more complex and tricky effects like non-metallic metal, I like to get these areas out of the way as soon as I can, as there's a higher possibility that something could go wrong and the piece will need to be stripped. During a normal workflow, I try to work from the innermost areas to the outermost to minimize hitting completed areas, but this time I would just have to be extra careful when I eventually came back to the red. After the base coat was dry, I like to quickly just go around and block out any surrounding details on the red using a darker colour, this time using a mix of Doomball Brown and a touch of AK Black. This will feature as part of the deeper shading step anyway, and it just helps to keep everything neat and tidy and for me to focus on these gold areas first. Once that was dry, I mixed Doomball Brown into XV88, making a glaze which would then be used to start to create some shading on the non-metallic gold areas. When working with non-metallics, you can also choose to block in the highlights or the shadows first when working over a mid-tone like this. I've tried both methods over the years and they both work very well. There's also a lot of different colours that will work great as shading for gold. Common ones that I also use would be something like Mournfang Brown and Rhinox Hide. Basically any darker browns will work fine, and you can even just add black into the base coat itself as long as it's darker than the initial base coat. For non-metallics, I find that it's essential for a good looking and convincing effect to think about value contrast first and foremost. If you get this right, then saturation, hue, and also even the smoothness of the result can be more easily tweaked later on using glazes. So as I apply these initial stages, I'm much more concerned about the placement rather than the smoothness of the blends themselves. Smoothness of finish on the other hand, and whether there's actually any physical texture build-up from the paint itself is still extremely important to me, and this is something that's not easily rectified later on. And this is why I tend to work with thinner paint here, just sketching in the shadows and highlights first and moving them around if I'm not too happy with their position. Next, I continue building up this shading using pure Doomball Brown, and this is still applied as a glaze, building up some more contrast into the shading. When I'm thinking about where to place this shading, and later on the highlights themselves, I'm imagining where my light source would naturally fall onto the surfaces. Faces that are more extremely angled facing away from my light source will have more shading applied to them, whilst ones that are more directly facing my light source will instead have more highlights applied. There's also a couple of methods that I find really helpful for working this out, such as taking a picture of the part just primed black with a light source from above, or even looking for similar shapes in real world objects and seeing how the light behaves on them. And although the heavy metal style of painting non-metallics is a much more stylized approach, some good references can still be a very important resource for helping understand how light behaves on metallic objects. A further darker shade was then made using a mix of Doomball brown and black. This was then applied to build up some further contrast on the shaded areas. I find it's really important to push this shading quite far, as it will be essential for creating the non-metallic effect once the highlights are applied. Next up, it's time to apply the initial highlights to the gold, and for this I added some ice yellow into the XV88. I really enjoy using ice yellow as it's a nice cold yellow that contrasts well against the warmer tones in the shading. Either the AK or Vallejo ice yellow works fine for this. And you can also opt to use Dawn Yellow from Citadel if you have that instead, although it's a slightly warmer yellow tone. Other colours that will also work for this are Shabty Bone, Screaming Skull, or even just adding white into the base coat. Later on, I'll also go on to show how you can easily tweak the colours using transparent glazes. I am gradually starting to add more ice yellow into the XV88, building up these highlights and covering less area as I go. If the highlight placement doesn't look right or the transitions aren't smooth enough, then this can be easily fixed later on by glazing back with the XV88 stage. Now for the most extreme highlights, I've continued working up to pure ice yellow. I will later go on to add some further highlights with white, however before that final stage it's important to continue to work to get the transition smooth enough and also to tweak any colours, which I'll show next. At this stage it's starting to look pretty good and I'm happy with the placement of the shadows and highlights, however there's still a lot to be done to help pull some saturation back into the gold. Okay, so now with all of this done, it was time to really boost up the saturation in the gold and help bring some colour back in which had been lost during the highlight stages. You can really use a lot of different transparent paints to do this, and I believe Darren Latham used the old yellow and red Citadel inks for this, as well as some of the old glaze paints. I think possibly some of the new contrast paints would work too, although I've not really tested them for this purpose. I then remembered that there were some awesome transparent inks that ProAcryl produce, and I've used them in the past to tweak the colours of a backdrop of a Golden Demon entry, and they had the absolute perfect finish that I was looking for. Now you can also tweak the finish of glossier inks by mixing in some matte medium like AK Ultramatte, but these paints already had the perfect finish that I was looking for. However, the colours are very limited of these inks, so I had to mix a warmer tone by adding a tiny touch of the red into the yellow. This was then thinned down until it was mostly water, and I would really urge on the side of over thinning this and make sure that you test any inks or transparent glazes on an area that doesn't matter first, as the last thing you want is to ruin all of the hours of blending work. But apply correctly, a few subtle thin glazes of this ink really helps to tie all of the previous stages together and also introduce some nice warm saturation back into the gold. When I'm applying this glaze, I'm trying to push the brush towards the more shaded areas, leaving some of the highlights untouched. The colour from the ink will more easily show on the lighter areas, so applying too much of this ink into the highlights will result in losing some of the value, and therefore you might find that you need to reapply them after this stage is dry. These inks are also a fantastic way to add saturation and unify many different areas of your miniatures, and not just useful on non-metallics. Once that was dry, it was time to add some final highlights to the gold, and I did this by mixing some AK white into the ice yellow. I find that these final highlight stages are when everything really starts to come together with non-metallics, and you can also add smaller specular reflections that you might find on metallic objects, such as reflections from nearby sources. I enjoy a very shiny and polished looking metallic here, so I like to add lots of these little white spot highlights on the surface, and I find it really helps to sell the overall effect. With most of the gold now finished, it was time to continue with the red of the shield. To shade this, I made a mix of Inky by Darkness and Corn Red. This created a nice cold purple tone that will contrast really nicely against the rich non-metallic gold. I thinned this to a glaze consistency and applied it over a few thin layers to build up the shading. This shading also follows the same overall rules as the non-metallic areas, so areas that are facing away from my light source, as well as the recesses themselves, will receive more of the shading. And I would normally be using a much larger brush for this purpose, however I really wanted to maximize my control of the paint here, and avoid touching any of the non-metallic areas. Once that was dry, I then started to apply the first highlights with Wazdakka Red. Applying these highlights around the outside of the red and in between the gold areas was very difficult to do, but it does look great once all of the highlights are established, and it provides some great definition separating these two areas. And for the next sharper highlight stage, I made a mix of Squig Orange and the previous Wazdakka Red. I then worked these highlights up to pure Squig Orange on the sharpest edges. For the final highlights, I added Ungor flesh into the squig orange. I then applied a few spot highlights on the very sharpest corners of the details using Screaming Skull. Now it was time to paint the serpent on the shield, and for this I wanted a nice contrasting colder metallic, but also something which I'd introduced elsewhere on the miniature and would tie it together. So for this, I used a very similar recipe to the one that I'd used for the sword that the lion is carrying, and you can find the previous tutorial for how I did this here on Patreon. Starting off with a base coat of Skaven Blight Dinge, but you could also use any mid-tone grey paint for this. I then started to block out some highlights using a mix of Carrick Stone and Administratum Grey. I think on the sword I used his Shabti and Administratum, but this was pretty close. And again, the same as with the gold, I'm paying attention to the direction of my light source and following the same rules. Next it was time to shade this, and this was done with some very thin glazes of Incubi Darkness. I then started to add some further highlights to the silver by adding some white into the admin and Carrick mix, and then applying this to the upwards facing areas. Before then going back in and applying a deeper shade of Incubi Darkness in black. I then applied a sharp edge highlight using a mix of Administratum, Carrick Stone and white. I then added more white into this mix for the very sharpest final highlights and reflections. To add a bit more warmth and some more interesting variation of hue into the metal, I glazed a small amount of a very thinned down Rhinox hide into some of the shadows. A few final spot highlights of pure white were then added to finish the metal. Next, I wanted to create a more brassy tone for the wreath on the head of the eagle, and for this I ended up using a bit of a weird mix of Ungor Flesh, Administratum Grey, which I added to desaturate it, and then a small amount of Mournfang Brown. This recipe ended up working out okay in the end, but I think if I was to approach it again, I would probably just mix Ushabti bone into Rhinox hide, or something like that to really separate it from the surrounding gold, and really make it look a bit more like brass. But like I said, this did work out okay in the end. Once that was dry, I added a recessed shade of a mix of Rhinox hide and Mournfang Brown. I then went on to establish some highlights with the mix of Ungor Flesh and Administratum Grey. Further highlights were then made by adding some white into the previous mix. I continued adding white into this mix for the further highlights. I then decided to push a bit more contrast and shading into the leaves using a thinned down pure Rhinox hide. I then went back in and tidied up a few of the previous highlight stages. And then finally applied a few white dot highlights to the sharpest corners. The jeweled necklace of the eagle was then picked out using a similar recipe to the serpent, but this time just using neutral greys instead. For the red gemstone, I started off with a very dark base coat mix of corn red and black. Around 2/3 of the gemstone was then layered using corn red and leaving some of the previous stage on the uppermost corner. Within this stage, I then applied a layer of Mephiston Red. This was then followed by Evil Sunz Scarlet. An edge highlight of Wild Rider Red was then applied around all of the edges of the gem. And for the next sharper edge highlight, I used Fire Dragon Bright. And I glazed a small amount of this towards the bottom corner of the lens. I then added some white into the Fire Dragon Bright for the final sharp highlight. Now onto the blue gem, and for this I first base coated it using Kantor Blue. I then highlighted this using Sotek Green. And for the next stage highlight, I used Temple Guard Blue. For the next stage highlight, I used Baharroth Blue. Lastly, I added some white into the Baharroth Blue for the final sharp highlights. And also applied a white dot at the top of the gem. Now onto the parchment, and for this I first base coated it using Ushabti Bone. For this parchment, I wanted to add some cool little details, similar to the box art version, with a little checkerboard pattern and some Dark Angel symbols. So I started out by sketching the checkerboard with a grid. I then filled in every other square to make the Chet pattern. I find doing any freehand like this much easier to do first before the shading, as it's possible to go back in with the Ushabti and tidy up any wonky freehand or make any necessary adjustments. As you can see here, I did have a little bit of tidying left to do with the Ushabti stage, but this is so much easier to do without having done the shading first. Now when it came to painting in the tiny little Dark Angel symbols at the ends of the parchment, I had a much more difficult time. At first I was using Rhinox hide and I was having a great deal of difficulty just trying to get the paint to come off of the tip of the brush. And then I ended up switching to the Two Thin Coats equivalent, I think it's called Cuirass Leather, and this had much better flow than the Rhinox hide and it ended up making it much easier to sketch out these symbols. So I was really happy that I ended up trying this in the end, and I think I might use those paints for future bits of freehand. Now, again, I did have to go back in with the Ushabti stage and just tidy these up a little. I then continued on adding the larger capital lettering to the body of the parchment. I then painted a lot of smaller lines of text and details onto the parchment. You can always opt to leave these until after the parchment's shaded though. Now for the shading, I added a few subtle washes of a mix of Seraphim Sepia and Reikland Flesh Shade. Some final highlights were then used to pick out the edges of the parchment, starting off with Screaming Skull and then adding white into this. The waxy red seals were then picked out with a 1:1 base coat of Screamer Pink and Corn Red. Once that was dry, I added some Kantor and black into the previous mix to shade it. This was thinned down to a wash consistency to allow it to flow into all of the recesses. To highlight the wax, I gradually added Ushabti Bone into the base coat mix. For the final highlights, I simply added white into the previous mix. And that's about it for this video. I know this one was a bit of a longer one as there's so many different elements to cover on the shield alone. There's also some bits around the back of the shield to do as well, but I just couldn't fit it into this video. However, I hope you've enjoyed the series so far, and I look forward to continuing the rest of the line very soon. So I'll catch you next time.